Good morning, everyone. I am Esteban Escudero, and today I will be discussing with you the internal conflicts that plagued America throughout the duration of World War II. While there are way too many to go into detail about, we will be focusing on the specifics on social conflicts in regards to racial injustice in the African American communities, the social unrest that persisted in the American Southwest between Mexican labor workers and the government, and conclude by touching on the often ignored plight of the Jewish refugees in America seeking asylum from tyranny in Hitler-controlled Europe. So let's begin. Looking back at World War II through a modern lens, it seems almost unimaginable that an entire country could come together for a common goal, especially considering the circumstances and divisiveness facing our nation today. We are all taught about war bonds, the civilian purchase of federal debt to fund the war and be paid back after the war, and the huge undertaking of women taking over the workforce duties to run the nation's manufacturing, and probably the most outlandish of all, victory gardens, the idea that Americans sacrificed their nutrition and began to plant their own food to aid the war effort seems incredible today. These examples are all true, but unfortunately it paints an incorrect image of the true circumstances of the American home front during World War II. This is because it gives an image of unity and full support of everything the federal government was doing to win the war, when that is just simply not the case. Despite the Emancipation Proclamation officially declaring all slaves in the South free over 50 years ago, African Americans in the United States were still, for the most part, relegated to a life of poverty, manual labor, and second-class members of society. Despite efforts made by the NAACP in the years leading up to the war, efforts to pass anti-lynching bills were unsuccessful in Congress. In a letter to John Boykin to Senator Richard B. Russell in 1938, Boykin attests to what many in Congress felt by saying that the federal government would not intervene in lynching matters because that was purely a local government issue, much like other crimes. These sentiments were not uncommon, and inaction is what kept the African American communities from being able to move forward in American society despite making the same efforts as whites to support the war in terms of taxes and sacrifices at home. The African American communities were not the only ones facing the plight of injustice during the war. In the American Southwest, where most of the labor was done by Mexican and other Central American immigrants, the local governments were struggling to maintain control of how to effectively use the cheap labor of these ethnic groups and still maintain clear control of the local population. When the war began, many in Congress felt that it would serve the nation well to bring in thousands of laborers from Mexico to work on the farms in the West and the South to aid in the agricultural war effort. The Bracero program, which was enacted in 1942, allowed Mexican workers to pass freely to work and live in communities that had them segregated from the rest of the local white population. While the labor was cheap and the production was high, the Mexicans were faced with poor living conditions and were paid very little for their work. This created tension between the two groups, and tensions like these peaked during the Suit riots in Los Angeles in 1943, which consisted of clashes between American servicemen and authorities against Mexican youth in the city. The Latin communities continued to be underserved after the war, and justice failed to play a role in their lives. When Hitler took power in Europe in the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of Jews fled Europe to the United States for refuge. This unprecedented influx of immigrants caused the American immigration offices to become overcrowded in paperwork and checkups. In 1936, a letter from then New York Governor Lemon to the federal government, he states that in order to keep up with the growing number of processes, the staff at local consulates would be increased and doctors would work full-time to process the immigrants. This was a testament to just how many new people were showing up on the streets of the Upper East Coast every day. This caused resentment of the locals towards Jews, and anti-Semitic propaganda began to spread about them in regards to Americans losing their jobs to European Jews. As you can see from the newspaper headline here, America still won the war, but in conclusion, it now becomes pretty clear that the conditions of World War II America were far from united or fully immersed in the war effort. While American troops were thousands of miles overseas fighting against oppression, marginalized groups here in the United States were fighting oppression every day against the American government. Thank you for listening. I am Esteban Escudero, and I hope you enjoyed today's discussion.